Hey everybody, welcome to the Corporate Podcast Report, which is a look at some of the latest findings in the world of corporate podcasts, some of the data collected by the Pikkal team about what's going on in the world of podcasts, particularly business, corporate, enterprise podcasts. We have a look at the data during this show every week. My name is Graham Brown. So let's get an understanding of the corporate podcast market. Today, we'll have a look at what corporate podcasts are and what they're not, and also how big this market is, generally the podcast market. I'll share data with you today. If you have any questions, you can contact me through the Pikkal website, the details here on the screen, or you can connect with me, Graham Brown, on LinkedIn. So let's jump straight in. Let's talk about consumer and corporate podcasts. There is a big difference. We're all familiar with podcasts like Joe Rogan or True Crime podcasts. These are consumer podcasts. These are not corporate podcasts. And whilst each has an individual listener, the purpose and the content are very different. So a consumer podcast is aimed at the consumer market, and the goal is to build up advertising real estate that somebody can buy or sponsor. So in the case of Joe Rogan, obviously sponsored by Spotify. But in the case of many consumer podcasts, these really are real estate for advertisers to buy impressions, to buy audiences on. That's the consumer market. With the corporate podcast market, and you can see examples of corporate podcasts here, very different. The advertiser for the corporate podcast is actually the brand, the corporate brand who is running the podcast. They are the advertiser already. You already have the best and most aligned advertiser with your audiences. So don't go out and seek other advertisers. You already have one, and use that for the purposes of your business. And as we'll dive into in this journey into corporate podcasts, we'll learn about how corporate podcasts work, particularly how the metrics work, because obviously the metrics for consumer and corporate podcasts are different. On the one hand, consumer podcast is all about volume. It's all about advertising impressions. Whereas with the corporate podcast market, the metrics are very different. The podcasts in the corporate market could have 2,000, 3,000 listeners, but that could be extremely valuable if those listeners are high value potential leads, clients for those corporate brands. They could be CEOs of banks, for example. So you don't need many of those to make that asset valuable for the brand. So they're going to be measured in very different ways. And as we'll do in this series, we'll look at metrics and measures of success in both consumer and corporate podcasts and how they differ. Let's have a look at market growth. So how big is the corporate podcast market today? It's getting closer to 1 billion listeners in the entire podcast market. So when we talk about corporate podcasts, whilst the number is smaller than consumers, the listener group is the same. You know, there still are people out there that listen to podcasts. They are as likely to listen to a corporate as a consumer podcast if it was as interesting and as relevant to them. So people who listen to podcasts, let's look at just that market first and look at how big that market is today. So in 2023, according to the latest data, we have 810 million podcast listeners. And podcast listeners are defined by regular podcast listeners, so people who listen every month. 810 million globally, and that has grown 3 to 4 times in the last 7 years, significantly in the last 3 years because of the pandemic. Podcast listenership is up. Now, let's have a look at the nature of this listenership, because it's important not just to understand that there's nearly 1 billion listeners out there, but who are these people? Who is listening to podcasts? Let's break it down by country first. And if we can zoom in on this chart, we can see individual countries and how they are listening to podcasts. There we go. So if we can zoom in on this chart, you can see, according to the global adoption here, according to data from the Reuters Digital News Report, Ireland, Sweden, Norway, Spain all have higher listenership in podcasts than the US and Canada. So what's interesting about this data tells me that what once began as a very US-centric market is now global, meaning that we often thought of podcasts as something that Americans do and Americans produce and Americans consume. But there are equally as many listeners all over the world in different countries, increasingly in Asia and Asia Pacific as well. And the numbers there add up. You've got 4 billion people, so you don't need a large percentage to make that a sizable market. So we've done global adoption. Now let's look at demographics. 60% of millennials listen to podcasts regularly compared to 40% of all adults. Let's have a look at that again. 60% of millennials listen to podcasts regularly as opposed to 40% of all adults. And millennials are now becoming the most influential demographic because now millennials, some are even in their 40s, believe it or not, millennials are occupying positions of authority within their businesses. They are now key consumers of financial services products and now key buyers. You know, millennials are buying houses, buying cars, they're CEOs, they're starting businesses, they're hiring people. So these are a demographic which not only has a lot of influence and power in the consumer market now, but that will increase over the next 10 to 15 years. So it's a market that is valuable for brands to build relationships with. And 60% of millennials listen to podcasts regularly. Let's break that down a little bit. Percentage of people who listen to podcasts regularly by age group, in particular, the largest market consumer group of podcast listeners, according to eMarketer, is the 18 to 34-year-old demographic, which I find really fascinating because if you look at the data here, the highest group here actually is the 18 to 24-year-olds with well over 60% of podcast listening regularly. So the 18 to 24-year-olds is the biggest demographic. I find this interesting because I spent a large part of my career working in telecommunications and understanding how young people used mobile phones. And if you can find a communication technology which is popular with young people and less so with old people, you have a communication technology that has the potential to go global and the potential to last many decades, as we have seen with mobile phones. The reason being is that young people have the greatest demand for technologies that connect us. And so if we want to understand podcasts, we really need to understand it through the lens of young people consuming it, which is, it's not about content, it's about connection. You see, when we start talking about podcasts as content, we see it as yet more social media in the marketing mix. You know, marketing is a choice of channels for your message. It's about, do I go with Twitter or TikTok or Instagram or LinkedIn? And podcasts, when you view them as content, just become one more piece of content for those channels. That's the marketing way of viewing podcasts. But the difference here is that podcasts aren't a choice of channel for your message. Podcasts are your message. So once we start seeing them as the message and the tool to connect listeners, then we understand its true power. The reason being is that when it's content, it's just another social media play. When it's connection, we can understand what emotionally listeners want from podcasts. They don't want more information, more content. They want to feel part of something. In the same way, young people didn't want more technology or want more SMS or MMS. They wanted tools to help them connect with each other. And that is what podcasts do. They connect. They create a community. They create an interest economy for people with shared passions. Podcasts are conversations that matter with people who care. And the answer lies in looking at the demographics of podcasts. To quote William Gibson, who invented the word cyber, he said, "The future is out there. It's just not evenly distributed." So the one thing that I want us to take away from the Pikkal Corporate Podcast Report is we need to start thinking about podcasts in a different way. We need to start thinking about podcasts in the way that young people are consuming them today. Not for information, not for content, not for more social media, but as a way to connect. They feel when they listen to that podcast, they are sitting around the table with the host and the guest. That is the connection that young people don't have today. Those are the conversations that we don't have anymore. And when we get to that level of demand, when we understand podcasts at the raw emotional level of what it means to listeners, then we can fully understand how we can create content and connection that really matters. So you've been watching the Corporate Podcast Report. My name is Graham Brown. If you want to find out more, go and check out Pikkal, Pikkal, the Corporate Podcast Agency. That's Pikkal, for more information on the corporate podcast market.